Sarah Jo, Cora, and Maggie Goddard coming to tell us about their family's history on the ranch. And then Grandpa Dan is going to finish up with just a few stories. Okay. You guys here, I'll be talking around in here. You can just hold the mic so that they can see you. So you gotta turn it on and you're ready to go.
Hi everybody, I am Sarah Jo Goddard. I am David and Heather's oldest, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Goddard Ranch history. How an English world traveler became a founding father of Niobrara County and 5 generations of ranchers, or the story of my great-great-great-granddad. Daniel Everett D.E. Goddard Sr., my great-great-great-granddad. D.E. Goddard was born and raised in Wallington, Surrey, England, born to his father, D.E., and mother, Elizabeth, on June 28. In 1860, the oldest of 8, he did well in school, attending through university level following his school days. D.E. traveled to Fiji Island and worked in a custom house for 2.5 years before making the decision to immigrate to the U.S. In 1878, 4.5 years before making the decision to immigrate to the U.S., in 8 years he lived and worked in Osborne County, Kansas. There he met and married Matilda Spain. In 1886, him and Matilda and their 3 children, including the oldest, D.E. Jr., and 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Edith, moved to the small hamlet of Lusk, Wyoming in Niobrara County. At the time, Lusk was a small multi-family town of only 35 people, but D.E. saw its potential and knew that he could help to transform this burgeoning town on the edge of the prairie. During his time in Kansas, D.E. had become an attorney, and after moving to Wyoming, he continued to work as a barrister and was also a postmaster of Lusk, a position he had held for the next 19 years. D.E. and Matilda built their family as the town of Lusk rose up. He was known for his vast ranch holdings and his civic involvement. D.E. served as a town clerk and was appointed as a U.S. Court Commissioner in 1905, serving as a judge. He and Matilda built a showcase home on the corner of 3rd and Main, where today's Yesway sits. It was a large structure with impressive grounds. D.E. was a member of the Catholic Church, but that was his wife's religion. He never quite felt at home in the church, since he had come from a staunch Church of England background. This led D.E. to help found, build, and pastor the St. George Episcopal Church. D.E. was also a founding and active member of the Lions, Oddfellows, and Knights of Columbus. After 24 years of marriage, he lost Matilda in 1905. In 1910, he married Florence Webster and had 2 more children, Robert and Florence W. Florence was a match for her husband in both intelligence and ambition. While D.E. is credited for being a major builder of Niobrara County, Florence was fundamental in the improvement of the cultural and educational offerings in Lusk. She was extremely active in the Women's Club and was credited with being instrumental in bringing of the Carnegie Library to the community. D.E. Sr. was considered so instrumental in the growth and progress of the community that upon his death, October 2, 1934, a resolution of condolences was proclaimed by the town government. It was estimated that, quote, his greatest work towards building for the future and local expansion came in assisting newcomers filing for homesteads. This is estimated that more than 80% of the land filed, proved up, was transacted before him. One of those homesteads was the ranch filed on, proved up, and operated by his son, D.E. Goddard Jr., the oldest of his children born in Kansas. Jr. was only 3 when Sr. moved their family to Kansas, from Kansas to Wyoming. While Sr.'s cattle days may have been behind him, Jr.'s were just beginning. In 1886, Lusk was still a tiny frontier town town, but by the time G.E. Jr. was 21, he knew ranching would be his life. In 1907, he filed on a homestead, and in 1909, he married Blanche Green, a school teacher from Houston, Texas, who was teaching at the Bonsall School south of Dan's homestead. After returning from their honeymoon, Dan and Blanche went about building a new home and family. First, a new house. Dan had been living in a log cabin tucked into a hillside. Following his marriage, Dan built his bride a new house on the one which still stands and is as a family home today. They also started family. John was born in 1911. Tragedy struck the young couple following the birth of their second son, Bert. In 1912, Bert was only a little over a week old when Blanche unexpectedly hemorrhaged at home while her husband was gone to town to get supplies. The entire community mourned with Dan and his two small children. Dan continued to work and live on a ranch with support from his family and friends. He proved up his claim in 1912 and expanded the ranch to include the Bonsall homestead, where he had met Blanche. This homestead house still stands on the current-day Goddard Ranch. Mary Effie Sheridan entered their lives in 1919, bringing a stepbrother, Alan, Dan Sr., by 14 years, along with two sisters. They had moved to Niobrara County in 1912 with his father, Joe, who subsequently passed away. The Sheridan family brought their own homestead to the family collaboration. The Sheridan homestead north of the home base, which is still referred to as the homestead pasture, and Alan and Blanche's own filings west of the main house. A stove can still be found where Alan originally homesteaded. Red Durham cattle were the breed of choice for D.E. Jr., and these were a primary source of income for the ranch. However, like most homesteaders, they also had chickens, horses, and raised their own feed crops. In 1935, just 1 year after his sister and brother Robert died, D.E. Jr. died suddenly while working in Grand Junction, Colorado. Reports were that he succumbed to a sudden heart attack while shearing sheep at a holding in Fruita, Colorado. D.E. Jr.'s death left his son, only 24 at the time, as an existing male heir of the Goddard name, but he wasn't alone. Alan and Blanche continued to ranch with John.
With his father's death in 1935, John took on the bulk of the cattle ranching on the Goddard Ranch. His brother Bert had died from internal injuries after a freak accident when he was playing football and accidentally kicked a sagebrush stump instead of the football in 1928. Although older than John, Alan's passing
Alan's passion was horses and John's was beef cattle, namely introducing Herefords to the herd. War came calling, and while Alan had served in World War I, John was called into action for World War II, leaving the ranch in Alan's hands. John served in World War II from March of 1942 to October of 1945, serving as a mechanic in the supply ran for Iran for almost 4 years.
Upon his return to Niobrara County, John did what most vets did to forget the war, and return to the life he loved. In 1949, on December 23rd, he married the girl next door, Evelyn Heth, whose family also ranched in the Hat Creek area. John and Evelyn continued the tradition of community involvement in civic service. John was a community commissioner for 16 years. He was a member of St. George's Episcopal Church, Farm Bureau, American Legion, VFW, and the Elks Lodge. Evelyn worked at the Hat Creek Postal Office and was an active member of the Hat Creek Community Club. Her fudge chocolate cakes were practically county-wide famous and continue to be a family favorite when baking by the current monarch Terry. John and Evelyn worked hard and raised their two children, Daniel A., born 1952, and Maxine L., born May 4th, 1953. Alan continued to live and work on the ranch alongside John and Evelyn. Although he never married Alan didn't doubted on Dan and Maxine, never passing up the opportunity to spoil his favorite grandniece and nephew. With Mary's passing in 1946, half of the ranch was left for Alan and half to John. And while they didn't always see eye to eye, they make the most management decisions together. The ranch continued to move ahead in agriculture. The first tractor was brought on the black market and was an OF-12. Later, Alan and John purchased an MD and a H tractor.
Draft horses, Alan's love, were on their way out. Alan had spent 30 years breeding draft breeds, thoroughbred studs, and working to make his lines leggy and stretched out. An avid elk hunter, Alan wanted horses so that he could go all day and could tail. John and Evelyn also raised chickens. They had an extensive garden, including a large potato patch out west. The whole family and some extended family were expected to help with the potato picking. Time marches on. When Dan was 5 years old and the family said goodbye to the last of the horse teams, when they sent Jack and Jenny, a team of mules, to auction in Lusk.
Eventually, Maxine moved out when she married Tom Mitchell, and they started a family in Torrington. Dan, however, stayed on after graduation in 1970 from Lusk High School. He went to work for the county. He was laid off by the county in the spring of 1971. Dan decided to attend Casper College to take some mechanist classes. At the height of the Vietnam conflict, Dan knew odds were pretty good he would get called up and the draft. But when he met Terry Etherton of Upton in the spring of 1972, that didn't stop them from getting plans for their future. Dan and Terry married September 30th, 1972. Dan had
received his draft notice. He was 55 and was the last round from Niobrara County. He was reported to Fort Dix in New Jersey on October 24th. Dan and Terry would spend the first 7 months of their marriage navigating Dan's service orders, eventually ending up in Aberdeen, providing grounds in Aberdeen, Maryland. They lived there from January until the war ended and Dan was released in May of 1973. Dan and Terry, in Dan's words, booked it back to Wyoming as fast as transportation could carry them. There they settled into a family house in Lusk. The house had been lived in by Effie, Alan's mother, and needed a lot of cleaning and improvement.
Alan had a house remodeled for them while Terry got to work cleaning. The Roper stove had been installed shortly before Effie's death. It was slated to be hauled off when Terry got to work on it to clean up before sale. She realized the stove had hardly been used and was with a little elbow grease, and it was good as new. So the stove moved back into the house, where it has been used by 2 more generations.
After the returning home, Dan worked at Volmer's machine shop for 5 years, while Terry worked at Ben Franklin's. Their daughter Carrie was born as a birthday present for Dan on May 19th, 1979. The son, David, joined the family on December 11th, 1982. After working at Volmer's, Dan went to work for the Niobrara County Roads Department, where he stayed on for 8 years. Terry ran an in-home day care at the house in town during this time at the county. Dan continued to work at the family ranch with his father John, taking a leave of absence every spring during calving season. In 1986, John told Dan that he could no longer do the work by himself, and Dan never returned to the county. He stayed at the ranch most of the time while Terry stayed in town with the kids. In total, they lived 13 years in town. Alan died on January of 1987, and John followed shortly after, in November. That year, Dan relocated the ranch, but his family would not allow him until 1989. In 89, Evelyn moved into town, and the next generation fully moved into the family home. David was just turning 5, and Carrie was in the 4th grade. Terry worked in the school district as a paraeducator.
As always, the Goddards stayed active in the community. Terry helped start the Homemakers Christmas Bazaar, and the kids were both active in 4-H and in school activities. The family was also heavily involved in the Legend of Rawhide production. Now known for their Herefords in the late 1960s, Dan suggested adding Angus to the line. The birth weights were getting so heavy from the Hereford bulls that they had an extremely high C-section rate. They brought in Black Angus bulls for the heifers. John often stated, "It took me 40 years to clean up the faces on those cattle, and my son ruined it all in 1 year." It was usually said with a smile, nice. Since their winning weight increased by 40 pounds in the first year alone after introduction, the English cross bloodline.
These are the cattle type that are still run today, F1 English cross with Black Angus and Herefords. As the family settled into the ranch life, Terry contributed with her first love, Suffolk sheep. Known for her purebred Suffolk flock, Terry and the kids showed both breeding and market classes at county and state fair. In the lean years, the sheep helped the ranch stay afloat through low cattle prices and drought years. While they no longer grew lots of crops, they continued to harvest dry land to hay alfalfa. Terry ran the open cab sticks while they were on the meadow bottoms, sometimes returning to the house so black grass and debris and pollen. All that you could see were her eyes and her mouth. They continued to use horses to move cattle and do most of the ranch work and bouncing around the county in a white Ford pickup. In the 2000s, the ranch bought their first Japanese thoroughbreds, as Dan put it, or a four-wheeler. This next step in the evolution of ranching would make it so that fewer people could do the work in half the time. Though they continued to keep the horses for riding in the rougher pastures, David and Carrie had several ponies and horses that kept them on their toes. The horse stories from their ranch, like many, could fill a book. However, as times passed and more ranch work had to be done on a four-wheeler, and the horses became less prominent in the day-to-day operations.
In April of 2003, Evelyn passed away and Terry became the official monarch. David and Carrie were both in college, and a new generation was just around the flip of the calendar.
As the ranch moved into the 21st century, David and Carrie were helping out in between college classes and on weekends. Carrie attended the University of Wyoming and then transferred to SCSU to work on her master's degree. David attended Eastern Wyoming College, majoring in business and welding. After 2 years, David had enough of city life and school, and they moved back home to the family ranch.
He settled in working full-time at Walt's Lathe machine shop working on the ranch. Carrie eventually married Chad Bannon from Harrison, Nebraska, and opened her shop Bloomers with business partner Twyla Barnett. The next generation started with the birth of Court to Carrie and Chad in August 2005. Terry started her catering business, Hickory Creek Catering, and then retired from the school district in 2020.
While they joke that Dan never gets off the ranch, he did make time to serve at the Omni board for a few years, as has Carrie. Terry continues to work in the district as a substitute teacher, and if there is a call for food, you can bet Terry is busy cooking, donating her time and efforts to any fundraiser that needs it. Carrie is a charter member of Lusk Rocks, an important community business organization. In December 2005, David made plans to visit a friend who was attending the university for a New Year's celebration. He joked to his friend that he planned to come down and sweep his roommate off her feet. David had never met the roommate. He just liked teasing his friend Matt. But little did he know that would be a prediction to come true.
David met his wife Heather on December 31st, 2005. They started seeing each other, making the 2.5-hour drive from Laramie to Lusk at all times of day and night to sneak in dates while continuing to both work full-time. while Heather attended the University of Wyoming. After just a few months of dating, David presented Heather with a pair of muck boots during calving season. Determining she did not own any footwear appropriate for tromping around in frozen mud and snow while checking the cows. It seemed to seal the deal, and by July they were engaged and would marry on his grandparents' anniversary, December 23, 2006. Heather moved to Lusk and worked at the Lusk State Bank. The young couple originally moved into a trailer house on the Scott Place, a small lease that the ranch ran their replacement heifers on.
After less than a year they moved in with Dan and Terry, and then relocated to the family house in Lusk. A few more moves, including back into that house. A few kids later, Sarah Jo in 2011, Maggie in 2013, Cora in 2015, and David and Heather followed the tradition of David's family. They broke ground on their house in the fall of 2017, with David determined to do as much of the work himself, just as D.E. had done a century before.
By this time, the trajectory of the fifth generation was following much of the same as those before. Live and work in town until they could carve out their own place on the ranch. David left the machine shop in 2012 and went to work for the state DOT. Following his time there, he opened his own machine shop and worked for Richard Waldock. Heather and David spent as much time as possible on the ranch working and raising their kids. In 2019, they welcomed Rebecca to the family, and then in 2023, Anna Lee was born. By this time, David was driving truck for Reed Truckin' and working on the ranch. Their homestead house was 7 years in the building and wasn't quite finished, though they had a large garden on the ranch and the girls kept in their sheep 4-H projects out there with Terry's flock. Heather originally worked at Lusk State Bank and served on the hospital board. In 2012, she went to work for the hospital administration in 2016. In 2016, she decided to stay at home with the kids full time. The family had stayed active in 4-H and this homeschool community. In June 2023, they moved into the work in progress. It took another 2 years and one more baby, but they eventually fully settled in on the ranch, moving out of the family home in Lusk. Baby Journey came home on July 23rd, 2025, and now they live full-time on their original Goddard Ranch, next door to the Vonsel Homestead House, just down the road from Dan and Terry.
So that's how 6 girls became the 6th generation of Niobrara County residents, and it all started with a world-traveling Englishman and his Kansas bride.
Thank you.